Although it had been around in some form or another since the American Revolution, the use of submarines in warfare didn't truly come into effect until the First World War, where it was used by both the Allies and the Central Powers in order to cut off commerce, blockade nations, and sink troop ships. Lessons learnt here would be perfected in the Second World War, but it remained a dangerous job, with crews facing not only the weapons of their enemy and the sea itself, but sadly often friendly fire and accidents from their own side. A fate that would befall the submarine HMS Umpire, 12 miles off the coast of Blakeney, Norfolk, just 9 days after her commissioning. One of the submarines ordered on the outbreak of war on the 4th of September 1939 to help bolster the size of the Royal Navy. She was laid down on the 1st of January 1940 in the famous Chatham dockyards in Kent, who had been building ships for the Royal Navy since 1567. She was a British U-class submarine, a series that had been in operation since 1936, very similar to the German U-boat. They were smaller than other classes of submarine in service at the time. The Umpire measured 60 metres in length, with a 4.90 metre beam and a 4.62 draft, weighed around 540 tons when fully loaded, and was powered by two 400 horsepower Paxman Ricardo diesel generators, as well as two electric motors. She had a speed of 11.25 knots on the surface and 10 knots while submerged. Her range was 4,500 nautical miles, and she was armed with 4 internal 21-inch torpedo tubes and a 3-inch naval gun. She was under construction for about a year before being launched on the 30th of December 1940 and sent out for sea trials. Placed under the command of Lieutenant Mervyn Wingfield, a stern and demanding officer, but well respected by his crew. They began local trials around the Kent coast. When her sea trials were complete, she was commissioned on the 10th of July 1941. Lieutenant Wingfield and his crew were ordered to sail from Chatham, heading north to join the 3rd Submarine Flotilla, stationed in Dunoon, northern Scotland, where the crew were to undertake a warm-up patrol before going into the Mediterranean. It must not be thought that because this submarine was new, her crew was inexperienced. Many of them already had years of service under their belts or had been in combat aboard other vessels. Her first port of call was Sheerness, Kent, where she would spend the night before joining a convoy heading north from the Thames estuary. Believing it was safer than making the journey alone, as the North Sea was a prime hunting ground for the German Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe from their bases in occupied Norway and the Netherlands. The first part of their journey from Kent to East Anglia went well, but their good fortune was not to last for long. On the evening of the 19th of July 1941, they developed a fault in their diesel engines, forcing them to travel on just their electric motors, meaning they soon began to fall behind the rest of the convoy. They sent a radio message to the commodore of the convoy reporting their problem, who sent a vessel back to act as a pilot, but it was unable to find them in the darkness. They were off the coast of Blakeney, Norfolk, when they came across another convoy, the FS-44, heading south, that passed their convoy in the wrong sea lane, passing starboard to starboard, as convoys generally passed port to port. This made the situation far more confusing, and would have been dangerous enough in daylight, but would prove deadly in the darkness. To reduce the risk of attack from German E-boats, all ships were running with their lights off, making it even harder to spot each other. Despite this, the Umpire made efforts to avoid the oncoming convoy, turning to port, only to suddenly have her steering falter, and instead of turning to port, she veered hard to starboard, right into the path of the Peter H. Hendricks, an armed trawler escorting the southbound convoy. The Hendricks crashed into the bow of the HMS Umpire, flooding her forward torpedo room, killing several of the crew outright and trapping others under torpedoes, men who would have to be left to their fate, as in order to save the rest, the watertight doors were closed. The collision also knocked out all power throughout the submarine, plunging them into darkness. She began to sink rapidly, going under in less than a minute, but before she did, it was reported that Lieutenant Wingfield called out, "You bastards, you sunk a British submarine." Beginning to sink, the mad dash for life began. Lieutenant Wingfield, as well as a navigator and 2 lookouts who had been on the bridge outside with him, threw themselves into the cold waters of the North Sea. Of these 4, only Wingfield would survive the rescue, pulled from the sea by the very trawler that sunk them. Below them, the Umpire plunged deeper, coming to rest 18 metres down on the seabed, with a 30-degree list to starboard. Among the crew still on board was Lieutenant Edward Preston Young, who described the situation for those still inside. The sea continued to pour on us with a terrible and relentless noise, and the water in the compartment grew deeper every minute. As the level grew up the starboard side, live electric contacts began spitting venomously, with little lightning flashes. Vaguely I wondered if we were going to be electrocuted. In the half-darkness, the men had become anonymous groping figures, desperately coming and going. There was no panic, but for most of us, I think, we suffered some sort of mental concussion. I discovered one man trying to force open the watertight door that I had shut earlier. My pal's in there, he was moaning. My pal's in there. It's no good, I told him. She's filled right up, and there's no one alive the other side of that door. He turned away, sobbing a little. The truck crew began to try and make their escape. Closest to the surface was four men in the control tower, who had been able to close the hatch above them as the sub sank. But with no Davis submerged escape equipment, an emergency rebreather developed in 1910 and adopted by the Royal Navy in 1927, it was issued to submarine crews and was perfect for shallow escapes in water such as this. Without it, their chances must have looked bleak. They decided their only option they had was to try and make a free ascent. All four of them would make it to the surface and be picked up, but two of them would die later from ruptured lungs due to holding their breath during this rather than emptying their lungs while surfacing. The list the umpire was resting on had made it impossible to close the engine room hatch properly, and it was now beginning to flood. The men who had taken refuge in here began to ready their Davis equipment, but only 17 of the 20 had them. It was decided that the three without would go first, attached to three with, to give them the best chance of making it. But, much like their four shipmates in the control tower, not all of them would. Only one would make it to the surface. It is believed that the other two were knocked unconscious after hitting the outside of the hatch as they escaped. For the men still in the flooding engine room, panic was close to setting in. This was before Chief Engine Room Artificer Killen took charge. After making sure the escape hatch was now clear, he began to send the others up, one at a time, making sure they had all made best their escape before making his own. He would be the last to leave the engine room and would be awarded the British Empire Medal for his bravery. Lieutenant Young, who for a time had believed he had been left behind while looking for a torch and coming back to find an empty control room, had been found by the sub's first lieutenant, Peter Charles McConnell Bannister, an engine room artificer and an able seaman, and they were now in the conning tower, beginning to make their preparations for escape. Closing the lower hatch behind them, they had just 14 metres to swim to reach the surface. In this process, the engine room artificer would never make it to the surface. Sight of him was lost as they opened the upper hatch. Lieutenant Bannister made it to the surface, but drowned, waiting for rescue. 16 of the crew would be rescued from the sea, but the accident would cost 22 lives. One of these, Sub-Lieutenant Stephen A.G. Godden, is buried in the Mundley All Saints War Cemetery in North Norfolk. Lieutenant Edward Young would go on to command HMS Storm, an S-class submarine, and would serve all over the world before leaving the Navy in 1945 with the rank of commander. He would win 2 DSCs, a DSO, and be mentioned in dispatches. He would become a graphic designer in civilian life and would write about his experiences during the war in his memoir, One of Our Submarines, published in 1952. Lieutenant Mervyn Wingfield, the umpire's CO, would also go on to have a distinguished career in the Royal Navy, serving in both the European and the Pacific theatres of operation, would be awarded the DSO twice and the DSC, and he would retire with the rank of captain in 1962, and also write his memoir, Wingfield at War. Another of the crew to survive that terrible night was Charles Albert Band. He was already a professional sailor when he served aboard the Umpire, as he had joined the Navy in 1936. He escaped with most of the crew through the engine room hatch, but would lose his best friend doing it. He was recorded by the Imperial War Museum for their oral history project in the 1990s. His testimony of the sinking can be found in the link in the description. I highly recommend you listen to it, as it gives you an idea how chilling the sinking really was. The wreck still lays where she sank to this day, on what is known as the Sheringham Shoal, with members of her crew still entombed within her. Sadly, shortly after the war, she was sold for scrap, and large sections of her were either cut out or worse, blown away with explosives by salvagers, leaving her in far worse condition than she was from the sinking. Thankfully, she is now protected under the Protection of Military Remains Act 1986, so other than the occasional diver who comes to take pictures or pay their respects, she is left alone for the creatures of the sea to make their home. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. All the information and pictures used can be found in the description below. Feel free to subscribe and like if you wish. This was the sinking of the HMS Umpire, and this was a little bit of history.